If it were you, if one day you stepped off a fateful bus, your body covered in injuries with no one waiting for you and nowhere to go, what would you do? That afternoon in Red Hollow, the American sun blazed down. In the dusty street, Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the mail-order bride, her dress tattered, her face bruised, her hands trembling as she clutched an empty cloth bag. People looked at her, but no one approached. Not a word of inquiry. Not a hand reached out. In towns like Red Hollow, women traveling alone are often not seen as human beings. They are a burden, defective goods, something that society can turn a blind eye to. And then, in that very moment, Eleanor realized that if she didn't leave, she would be crushed by this very place. A man emerged from the end of the street. No hurry, no anger, no violence. His name was Caleb Warren, a rancher living alone on the edge of the prairie. He stood between Eleanor and the crowd. He spoke just one short sentence, enough to change an entire life. She's leaving. Come with me. If it were you, would you dare to follow a stranger when it was your only choice between a glimmer of hope and certain destruction? And if you were Caleb, would you dare bring a deeply wounded woman home without promises, without conditions, just on the basis of honor? Stay with us, because this isn't just a love story. This is a story about kindness, when no one forces you to be kind. If you love heart-wrenching stories, hit like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to join this journey now. There is no shade at midday in Dustmere. The sun loomed directly overhead, its white light stripping everything bare. Cracked wooden walls, a dirt road riddled with wheel tracks, and people accustomed to seeing life with a dry, indifferent gaze. There was no wind, only dust, the smell of horse manure, and a heat that irritated one even without a reason. The carriage stopped in front of the post office, the wheels screeching briefly before falling silent. The coachman didn't turn around. He simply pulled on the reins, waiting for the person behind him to understand that the journey was over. The woman stepped down slowly. Her name was Margaret Doyle. She didn't fall, though her legs were clearly unsteady. She gripped the side of the car for a moment, just a moment, then let go, as if not wanting anyone to see she needed help. Her dress was frayed at the hem, the fabric faded and torn at one side. Her coat was too thin for someone who had just endured a long journey. The collar had sagged, revealing old and new bruises, overlapping each other, needing no explanation. She stood still for a few seconds, letting the light and gaze of the town fall upon her. No one came forward. A man with a pipe in his mouth stopped mid-sentence. Two women in front of the tailor shop whispered something, then turned away. The pub door creaked open, then closed just as the eyes inside met the thin figure. In Dustmere, people were used to seeing people come and go, but not to seeing a woman arrive alone in such a state. Margaret felt it all, not with her ears, but with her skin. She pulled the small cloth bag closer to her. It was sadly light, not because she carried nothing, but because life had taken so much that there was nothing left to pack. A wooden comb, a thin Bible, a few coins, and a crumpled letter. That was her entire world at this moment. She was the daughter of a clergyman in eastern Pennsylvania. Her home had a white porch, church bells rang every Sunday morning, meals were eaten with prayer, and a naive belief that if you lived a good life, life wouldn't treat you too cruelly. Now she stands in the middle of Dustmere, a town born from the railroad, raised on strong liquor and the silence of the law, with a bruised body and a future without shape. Margaret didn't cry. It wasn't because she was strong, but because her tears had long since dried up. There are pains that have nowhere left to flow, lying dormant like stones at the bottom of a river, heavy and cold. A horse tethered nearby tossed its head, causing its bell to jingle. The sound echoed loudly in the stillness. Margaret jumped, then reproached herself for that reaction. She was no longer the easily frightened young girl she once was. Life had taught her lessons no book would dare to write. She took a step forward. Every step drawn drew a gaze. No one greeted. No one asked. In Dustmere, curiosity doesn't go hand in hand with compassion. People look to know, not to help. A man whispered loud enough for her to hear, "It must be from the mail order." No further explanation is needed. In border towns like this, women who arrive alone are often not seen as complete human beings. They are a latecomer, a flaw in an agreement, something society hasn't yet decided whether to pity or exploit. Margaret understood that very well. She understood the moment the carriage turned off the main road and stopped here, where no one was waiting, no name was called. The letter promising a marriage had not come to fruition. The man had changed his mind, or was dead, or had never existed. Whatever the reason, she was the one to bear the consequences. She stood there for a little longer, as if giving the town one last chance to prove she wasn't entirely heartless. No one came out. The sun seemed to force her head down. Dust clung to the hem of her dress. A fly landed on her bruised wrist, then flew away. Margaret took a deep breath. She didn't beg, not out of pride, but because she knew begging in Dustmere would only make things worse. She adjusted her purse, lifted her head, and began walking toward the dirt road leading out of the town center, where scattered farms lay across the prairie. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that standing still was more dangerous than moving forward. And as she left that carriage stop, no one in Dustmere understood that they had just turned their backs on a moment that would test their own conscience. A moment that would soon return, demanding their confrontation. Because in places where rules are as thin as dust, the silence of the crowd can sometimes be more cruel than a fist. And it is from that silence that something else will be forced to speak. The dirt road leading out of the center of Stoneford narrowed as she went, as if the town deliberately kept everything within its sight. Abigail Moore walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she sensed something shifting behind her, not sound, but intention. She had lived long enough to distinguish between the two. The heat was no longer the biggest problem. What sent a chill down her spine was the feeling of being watched. Not openly, not hastily, just the watchful eyes one by one, like people judging a skinny horse at the market. No need to shout because everyone understood. Abigail stopped in front of an old water barrel sitting beside the abandoned shop. She bent down and scooped up a mouthful of water with the metal cup hanging there. When she looked up, she saw them. 3 men. They stood not far from her, leaning against a weathered wooden wall. None of them seemed in a hurry. They had time, and they knew she did too, in a different way. One man wore a wide-brimmed hat, had a thick beard, and was chewing on something indistinct. The second was younger, with shifty eyes, and his hand habitually resting on his waist. The third was silent, but it was precisely that silence that made people uneasy. "Are you lost, ma'am?" The voice rang out, soft as a breeze, but devoid of any goodwill. Abigail didn't answer immediately. She set the cup back in its place, wiped her hands on her dress, and then turned completely around. No bowing. No retreat. It wasn't a challenge, simply a final reflex of dignity. "No," she said. "I'm just walking." The young man chuckled softly. "At Stoneford, people don't usually just walk, ma'am." The way he used the word madam made it sound heavy. Not respectful, but emphasizing the distance and power. Abigail could clearly feel her heartbeat. Not fast, not erratic, just steady, as if her body had been in situations like this enough times to know that panic wouldn't help. She knew what they were doing. They're not threatening. Not yet. They're measuring. The man in the hat tilted his head, looking her up and down. "Do you have anyone here?" The question sounded harmless, but Abigail understood the true meaning behind it. She shook her head. "Not yet." A brief silence passed, enough for the unspoken words to linger in the stifling heat. "Stoneford isn't an easy place to live," the third man said for the first time. His voice was low and slow, as if he were offering sincere advice. "Especially for women, traveling alone." Abigail swallowed hard, not out of fear, but because she had heard it before, in other towns with other faces. That same phrase always led to the same outcome, unless someone intervened. She recalled her mother's words long before the world became so harsh. There are places where the law isn't dead, it just hasn't arrived yet. Stoneford is one such place. "What do you want?" Abigail asked, her voice low but clear. The young man took a step forward, not too close. Just enough to invade her personal space. Just wanted to make sure she is safe. He smiled as he said the word. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Abigail understood perfectly well what awaited her if she continued to stand there. If she remained a nameless woman without companions, without a place to return to. In Stoneford, women like her were not seen as complete human beings. They were unsolved problems, voids that someone else would soon fill in their own way. She thought of the lightweight cloth bag. She thought of the bruises that hadn't yet healed. She thought of the road ahead, long and empty. And she thought of the most important thing she had survived to get here, not to disappear in silence. Abigail took a deep breath. "I don't need you to worry," she said. "I'll leave town before dark." The man in the hat chuckled. "You don't understand. Stoneford only truly awakens before dark. That statement hung in the air, needing no explanation. Abigail felt her palms sweating, but she didn't back down. She didn't turn and run, for running now would only make things worse. She stood there like a tiny landmark in a strong wind, knowing that one wrong step and everything would collapse. And it was at that very moment, when Stoneford had almost decided her fate, that something else began to shift at the end of the street. Quiet, unhurried. It was just a figure approaching with an unchanging pace. Before Abigail could think of what to say next, she noticed the three men's gazes had shifted, no longer directed at her but toward the person who had just emerged from the end of the street. In Dry Creek, everything follows its own routine. The afternoon is when the pubs are busiest. The main street is noisier than usual. People talk louder, laugh more, and look less. It's a time when things that shouldn't happen easily slip away because everyone has a reason to turn their backs. Clara Whitmore stood still in the middle of the street, three men in front of her, the space behind her empty. She felt an invisible boundary closing in little by little. No one touched her. Not yet, but the silence around her was beginning to smell dangerous. Then there were footsteps. Not fast, not rushed, without fanfare or dramatic determination. It was just the sound of leather boots hitting the dry ground, steady and rhythmic, like the footsteps of someone who had no reason to hurry because he knew he would arrive on time. The first to notice was the man standing closest to Clara. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping down the street, then stopping abruptly. The confidence on his face vanished quickly, as if someone had pulled the rug from his feet without touching it. The man walking towards us is Jonah Blackwood. He wasn't exceptionally tall. He didn't carry any conspicuous weapons. He wore a dark brown dust coat, a hat pulled low, and walked with the gait of someone accustomed to the wind, the sun, and standing alone in wide fields with no one watching. Jonah stopped a few steps away from Clara, and he stood between her and the three other men. There were no ostentatious protective gestures, no outstretched arms, no turning to look at Clara to reassure her. He just stood there like an old wooden fence, not new, not beautiful, but one everyone knew shouldn't try to climb over. "She came with me." His voice was low, slightly hoarse, as if he didn't use it much in unnecessary conversations. Not raised, not strained. The words were released without any questioning undertones. The three men looked at each other. No one laughed anymore. One of them mumbled something quiet enough that no one but they could hear. The younger man clenched his fist, then released it. The man in the wide-brimmed hat bowed slightly, not as a greeting but as an acknowledgement. In Dry Creek, everyone knows who Jonah Blackwood is. It wasn't because he showed up often, rather because he didn't need to show up often. His farm was west of town, where the soil was hard and the wind was strong. He paid on time. He didn't get drunk. He didn't cause trouble. And when he said something, it was usually well thought out enough not to need repeating. "We're just talking," said the man in the hat, his tone less arrogant. Jonah didn't look at him. He looked at the road ahead as if an answer wasn't needed for them. "The conversation is over. No threats. No conditions. Just a conclusion." Clara sensed the atmosphere had changed. Not out of fear, but because order had been restored in a very old, very quiet way. The men took a step back. Then another. No one had the last word. In towns like Dry Creek, the last word didn't belong to the loudest speaker. Jonah turned around, looking at Clara for the first time. His gaze was not scrutinizing, not pitying, not curious. Just a direct look, long enough for her to understand that he had seen everything he needed to see and didn't need to ask any more questions. "Can you go?" he asked. Clara nodded. Her throat was dry, but she didn't show it. She stepped closer to him, not touching him, just close enough to know she was no longer alone. They started walking. No one in town stopped them. No one asked where they were going. A few eyes followed them, but there was no whispering. When Jonah Blackwood walked away with a woman, it was clear that there were questions that shouldn't be asked. Clara didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he did it. She had lived long enough to know that there are moments when asking too soon would ruin what was happening. They walked a short distance, far enough for Dry Creek to begin to fade into the familiar sounds behind them. It was then that Jonah spoke, his voice still even and low. "She's not safe there." Clara nodded. "I know. Do you have anywhere to go?" She paused for a moment. "Not yet." Jonah nodded, as if the answer didn't surprise him. He adjusted his hat and looked toward the road leading out of town. My farm isn't far. You can stay here. No need to decide anything today. No promises. No obligations. It's just a door that's been opened just enough for someone else to step inside if they want to. Clara felt a strange sensation welling up in her chest. Not great hope, just the feeling that finally there was a man who didn't need to possess her to prove his power. She followed him, her pace gradually becoming more even. Behind them, Dry Creek continued to live its life as it did. But for Clara, the world had tilted slightly, just enough so she was no longer standing on the edge of a precipice. As they left the main street and turned onto the dirt road leading toward the prairie, Clara suddenly realized some decisions need no explanation. They just need someone to dare to stand up and someone brave enough to follow. The road leaving Willow Flats was not wide, just enough for a single horse-drawn carriage to pass. On either side were rows of wooden stakes, marking the boundaries of the land bent by wind and time. Helen Crowley walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but because with each step she was silently questioning things she dared not voice. The man walking in front is named Thomas Reed. She didn't know who he was. I don't know where he came from. I don't know what he expected of her. And strangely enough, that very lack of knowledge made her less afraid of the promises that had misled her whole life. Thomas walked at a moderate pace. He maintained a comfortable distance, neither forcing her to keep up nor letting her fall behind. This wasn't bookish politeness, but the habit of someone accustomed to working with land and people, knowing that everything has its own rhythm and shouldn't be forced. Helen looked at his back. His thick coat was worn at the shoulders. He wasn't young, but his build was steady. He didn't seem like someone who liked to give orders. Nor was he the kind of man who sought gratitude in the eyes of others. He just walked as if this path was meant for him to walk, whether she was there or not. She suddenly realized that what was driving her forward wasn't absolute safety, but clarity. In Thomas's eyes, as he stood between her and the other men, there was no judgment. No silent question of what kind of woman is she. Only one thing: he had decided it didn't matter. They won't bother you anymore, Thomas said when they had gone far enough for the sounds of the town to fade into the distance. His voice was low and even. It wasn't reassurance, but a truth being stated. Helen nodded. I know. She hesitated for a moment, then asked her first question since they left Willow Flats. Why did you do that? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked ahead where the road curved along the edge of the prairie. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of dry grass and warm earth. Because I won't let her stay there, he said. That's all. Not because. Not if. No lengthy explanation. Helen felt a lump in her throat. Not from overwhelming emotion, but from its simplicity. All her life she had been accustomed to conditional statements, promises that demanded reciprocity, doors that only opened if she entered in the role others expected. Thomas's statement didn't include any conditions. She looked down at her shoes, old dusty, no longer in their original shape. They were the shoes that had led her through so many wrong decisions. But today they continued to walk. Without turning back, Helen understood perfectly well if she stopped now there would be no next time. My farm isn't big, Thomas continued as if talking about the weather. Not crowded. You can stay as long as you like. I don't expect anything from you. She listened to every word and realized he was doing the rarest thing in this land, giving her the right to choose without pressure. Helen recalled past occasions when she had followed a man out of town. Back then she believed that following him was the only way. But deep down she knew she was being led, not walking on her own. This time, it's different. She followed Thomas not because she was being pushed into a corner, but because she had no reason to stand still. They walked a little further in silence. The sun began to set its light, becoming softer, no longer as harsh as at midday. The shadows of the two stretched long on the dirt road, parallel, but not touching. Helen noticed something small but important. Thomas didn't turn around to check if she was still following. He believed that if she wanted to go, she would go. And if she stopped, that was her choice. That belief, silent, unspoken, made her feel like an adult, not a burden to be looked after. Aren't you afraid? Helen asked softly. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Afraid of what? They're afraid I'll bring trouble. He smiled very gently. Not a smile of dispelling, but the smile of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the trouble doesn't lie with the people themselves, but with how they treat each other. Who lives here without bringing something with them, he said. Helen didn't answer. She just kept walking. In that moment she realized the decision she had just made needed no justification. No need to dwell on the past. No need to promise the future. It was simply the step of someone who had lost enough to understand that sometimes the right thing to do doesn't need an explanation. And so on the road leading out of Willow Flats, Helen Crowley followed Thomas Reed not as someone who had been rescued, but as someone who had chosen a different opportunity for herself. As the dirt road unfolded before her and Thomas's farm gradually came into view in the late afternoon light, Helen suddenly understood that there are places that don't need to be called home until you feel safe enough to sleep soundly without any defenses. Pine Hollow Farm sits low in the middle of the prairie, as if deliberately avoiding the sky. No high fences, no grand gates. Just a winding dirt road leading to a single-story wooden house, its roof sloping just enough to allow winter snow to slide off without accumulating. Mary Ellison paused at the entrance, not because she was tired, but because she wasn't sure whether she should enter quickly or slowly. There are places, even with the doors open, that still require a moment to believe that one is permitted to stay. Samuel Holt went ahead, placing the oil lamp on the hook near the door. He didn't turn to look at her, didn't urge her on. He only spoke as if to himself. "Come in. It's getting dark." Inside Pine Hollow there was nothing particularly striking. A long wooden table polished smooth by the passage of time. 2 neatly arranged chairs. A low ashless fireplace. On the shelf a few notebooks bound with jute string were neatly lined up. Everything there bore the mark of a disciplined man, unpretentious and without excess. Mary saw it immediately. It's not about wealth, it's about consistency. Samuel hung up his coat, washed his hands in the basin by the door, then pointed toward the small room at the end of the hallway. "That's for her. The bed is clean. The sheets are freshly washed." After saying that, he went back to the kitchen as if the matter had been decided long ago and needed no further discussion. Mary entered the room. The room was small, just big enough. A wooden bed with neatly pressed sheets. A low wardrobe. A narrow window overlooking a meadow where the late afternoon sun streamed in pale golden hues. No decorations, no flowers, no crosses hanging on the wall, but everything was in its proper place. She placed the cloth bag on the floor. The sound, so faint, was distinctly audible in the quiet room. Mary stood still for a moment, as if listening to her own breathing. There were no footsteps outside the door. No whispers, no eyes waiting for her to do something in exchange for her presence. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged slightly, gently supporting her body weight. Mary reached out and touched the sheets, clean, dry, with a faint scent of soap. A scent so familiar it surprised her. The last time she'd smelled it was years ago in a house where she'd thought she'd grow old. She took off her shoes. The gesture was small, but for Mary it meant more than simply putting down her luggage. It was the first sign of permission to rest, even if only for one night. As she lay down, the low ceiling appeared before her eyes. The oil lamp from the hallway cast a soft glow. Mary pulled the blanket up carefully, as if afraid of wrinkling something that didn't belong to her. Then she cried. No sobbing. No loud cries. Just tears flowing silently, steadily, like rain falling on dry land after a long season without water. She wasn't crying because she was afraid. She cried because for the first time in a long time nothing threatened her during the night. In the next room, Samuel sat at a table writing something in an old notebook. He heard a very faint sound. Not sure if it was a sigh or the rustling of a blanket. He didn't get up. He didn't ask. In Pine Hollow, it was believed that every emotion needed its own space to settle down. After a while, he put the notebook down, turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small fire burning in the fireplace, enough to keep the whole house warm. The night at Pine Hollow wasn't completely silent. The wind blew through the gaps in the wood. An owl hooted in the distance. But these sounds were all orderly, as if the world were doing its part so that humanity could be at peace. Mary woke up in the middle of the night, as was her habit. She expected the familiar feeling of panic, but it didn't come. Only the soft darkness and the warmth of the blankets. She closed her eyes this time, not out of caution, but to go back to sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window earlier than she expected. Mary opened her eyes, taking a few seconds to remember where she was. When her memory returned, it didn't bring with it her usual anxieties. Just one simple fact: she had spent the night safely. She left the room and found Samuel had been awake for a long time. On the table were slices of bread and a pot of coffee. There were no questions, no scrutinizing glances. He simply nodded slightly when he saw her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Mary nodded. "It's been a long time since I slept like this." Samuel didn't answer. He poured more coffee into the cup and gently pushed it towards her. They ate in silence. No awkwardness. No need to fill the gaps with words. At Pine Hollow, silence isn't an absence but a part of the rhythm of life. Mary realized she was beginning to observe the little things: how Samuel set the dishes after use, how he wiped the table, how he checked the windows before going out. Everything indicated that he was a man who set clear boundaries with his work, with his space, and with people. And that's what made her feel safe. It wasn't because someone was watching her, but because she knew what was allowed and what wasn't. As Samuel was about to leave for the stables, he stopped at the door. "If you wish to stay today, feel free to do so. If you wish to leave, I will show you the way." Mary looked out where the bright sunlight was spreading across the meadow. She didn't answer immediately. For the first time in a long time, she had time to think without being pressured. "Let me stay today," she said finally. Samuel nodded. "Okay." No further words. Mary stood alone in the log cabin, listening to his footsteps fade away. She placed her hand on the table and took a deep breath. Pine Hollow offered no promise of a future. It only offered her a peaceful day, and for Mary Ellison that was more than enough to get started. It was in the simple tranquility of Pine Hollow that Mary began to realize that lasting kindness doesn't need promises, it needs clear rules, and a man kind enough to follow them every day. In Cedar Ridge, mornings always start early. It wasn't because anyone liked getting up early, but because work doesn't wait. The early morning sunlight streamed through the wooden planks of the main house, casting long, even streaks on the floor like invisible lines, reminding everyone that everything here had its order. Ruth Calder woke up to the sound of the stable door closing in the distance. She wasn't startled, not panicked. She simply opened her eyes and listened. The old habit was still there, the habit of someone who had lived long enough in a state of constant vigilance, but it began to slow down like a machine that had run too long, being allowed to decelerate. When she entered the kitchen, Henry Lawson was already seated at the table drinking coffee. He nodded in greeting without rising or inviting her to sit. He simply left the seat opposite him empty, as if her presence there were taken for granted. They ate breakfast in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but a silence that needed no explanation. The sound of spoons clinking against bowls, the breeze rustling through cracks in the door. At Cedar Ridge, these small sounds were enough to fill the room. When the meal was over, Henry set his cup down, wiped his hands with a napkin, and then looked at Ruth, not for long, not intensely. Just enough for her to know he was about to say something important. "I want to clarify a few things," he said. His tone was calm, neither a warning nor a reassurance. It was more like how people talk about the weather or the planting season, things that need to be understood correctly, otherwise consequences could arise. Ruth nodded. She was used to conditions being laid out behind open doors. She braced herself to hear them. "Firstly," Henry said, "you owe me nothing." The words fell onto the table like a strange object. Ruth didn't react immediately. Not because she didn't understand, but because she had never heard of it in this context. Somewhere deep in her memory, she was accustomed to the idea that every act of help came with a price, whether that price was stated or implicitly understood. Henry continued, not wanting the silence to escalate into a misunderstanding. "She's here because she needs a place to stay. That's all." Ruth gently squeezed her hand between her palms. It didn't hurt, but it was enough to remind her she was awake. "Secondly," he continued, "no one is allowed to touch anyone unless both want to, and that doesn't apply here." He said it neither harshly nor evasively. It was stated as a pre-established boundary requiring no negotiation. Ruth lifted her head. She saw in his eyes neither defensiveness nor expectation. Just a calm certainty, a certainty that only comes from someone who has long since set their own rules. "Thirdly," Henry said, "how long you stay is your right. A day, a month, or longer, that's your decision. When you want to leave, I won't stop you." The kitchen fell silent. It wasn't a heavy silence, but the kind of silence necessary for something new to be laid down without breaking. Ruth looked at Henry. Then she looked down at the table. Then she looked at him again. She didn't believe it right away. It wasn't that he hadn't made himself clear enough. It was because her life had never worked this way. She was all too familiar with unspoken agreements, suggestive glances, and debts that were remembered and never erased. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft but not trembling. Henry shrugged slightly. "Because that's how I live. There is no backstory. There are no excuses. It's just a stated principle. Ruth realized something that puzzled her more than the kindness. He didn't need her to believe him right away. Henry got up and took his coat. "I'm going to the fields. You can do whatever you want. The house, the kitchen, feel free to use them." After he finished speaking, he left, leaving Ruth alone in the brightly lit kitchen. She sat there for a very long time. Do nothing. Just sit and let his words settle little by little like dust in the wind. Ruth knew that faith doesn't come from promises. It comes from the regular repetition of actions that don't contradict words. The first day passed without anything happening. No one controlled her. No one inquired about her past. No one counted how much she ate or when she slept. Henry returned in the late afternoon, washed his hands, had dinner, and then read. Everything happened exactly as he had said. The same thing happened on the second day. Ruth began to clean not because she was asked to, but because she wanted to. She mended a frayed corner of the curtain. She wiped down the shelf near the window. Small tasks unnoticed by anyone. But she realized Henry didn't stop her, nor did he take it for granted. He only said thank you once, just loud enough to be heard. By the third day, Ruth realized she was no longer waiting for the worst to happen. Her body still hadn't fully accepted it, but her mind was beginning to relax. Henry's rules were not mentioned again. They lived together day after day through things that didn't happen. No lingering glances. No questions that crossed boundaries. No silences that held any other meaning. And it was that unspoken kindness, that made Ruth begin to believe. Don't rush. Don't be naive. It's just a small belief enough to make the next day easier than the day before. It was during those uneventful days that Ruth gradually came to understand that true healing didn't come from grand promises, but from ordinary, repetitive mornings where no one needed to be on guard. Autumn arrives at Ash Creek Ranch, not with the roar of strong winds, but with subtle changes so profound that one will miss them if they don't live life at a slow pace. The morning was a little cooler. The sunlight was less harsh. The birds began to fly lower. Lydia Bennett realized this not because she was looking at the sky, but because her body had begun to pay attention to her surroundings instead of just being on guard against what was about to happen. She's been in Ash Creek for a few weeks now. No one counts the days. No one mentions the passage of time. Here, time is not measured by a calendar, but by repetitive activities: breakfast, boiling water in the kettle, the sound of the barn door opening each morning. Arthur Cole still rose before dawn. He worked in the fields, checked the fences, tended to the horses, and repaired the barn roof before the rain came. He didn't ask Lydia if she had slept well. He didn't ask what she planned to do that day. Not because he was cold-hearted, but because he believed that everyone needed to determine their own pace of life. Lydia started waking up earlier. No one told her to do it. But one morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, she sat up without that heavy feeling in her chest. She put on her coat, stepped outside, took a deep breath of the cool air, and realized she no longer felt pain when she breathed deeply. She started with very small things. She wiped down the wooden table where they had eaten breakfast. She picked up the straw that had fallen outside the door. She boiled water not because she was assigned to, but because she felt warm hearing the sound of boiling water. These tasks didn't tire her out. On the contrary, they brought her back to herself, a person who once knew how to care for her living space, who once believed that even small things mattered. Arthur said nothing. He only put the chair back in its place after Lydia had cleaned the floor. He hung the towel on the correct hook when she finished washing it. He left a dry log near the fireplace, enough to make the evening cooler than usual. No compliments. No judgmental glances. It's simply a quiet recognition, like how one keeps a fire from going out by adding fuel at the right time without needing to announce it. Lydia gradually realized that. Initially, she waited. She waited for a longer thank you. She waited for a simple inquiry. She waited for a sign that her work was valuable. It was an old habit, the habit of someone who had to prove they deserved to stay. But Ash Creek doesn't operate on that logic. One afternoon, Lydia mended a torn curtain. It was just a rough, unattractive stitch, but it was strong. When Arthur returned, he saw it. He didn't linger. He simply said, "The wind will stop blowing." Then he went to wash his hands. That statement, simple to the point, left Lydia speechless for a long time. Not because she was deeply moved, but because for the first time her value was recognized for what it truly was. A helpful act, nothing more, nothing less. Day after day, the bruises on Lydia's arms faded. Not because of time, but because she no longer tensed up whenever someone walked by. She slept more soundly, startled less, had fewer of the same old dreams. Arthur kept his distance. He didn't enter her space unless necessary. He didn't inquire about the past. He didn't pry into her silences. He understood that healing wasn't about digging, but about allowing a person to live long enough in the safety of telling their own story if they wanted to. On some evenings they would sit in the same room but do their own things. Lydia would sew. Arthur would mend the saddle. A small fire would burn in the hearth. No one felt the need to speak. It was in those quiet moments that Lydia began to feel a sense of belonging, not because she was invited, but because she wasn't being driven away. One time it started raining unexpectedly. Arthur came home later than usual. Lydia had prepared dinner. She didn't say she'd been waiting. She didn't ask why he was late. When he sat down, she simply pushed the bowl of soup toward him. Arthur looked at her and nodded. "Thank you. Just once. But that's enough." Lydia realized that he wasn't being stingy with his praise, but rather understood that words only have value when they aren't misused. He chose to acknowledge it by continuing to respect boundaries and live up to the established rules. And that made her believe. She didn't believe in the distant future. She didn't believe in eternal promises. She only believed in today, that it wouldn't betray her. One morning, Lydia proactively asked, "Can I help out outside the warehouse?" Arthur looked at her for a moment, without considering her abilities, without assessing her strength. "All right," he said. "You do what you feel comfortable doing. No assignments, no control." Lydia worked slowly, but she worked steadily, and when she got tired, no one saw her as a burden. Arthur simply handed her a water jug, set her down, and returned to his work. Needless to say, "That's enough, ma'am," because that action spoke volumes. Lydia came to a crucial realization, one perhaps only those who have lived long enough understand: true healing doesn't need anyone to proclaim it. It happens in ordinary mornings, in unsupervised actions, in the feeling that one's worth doesn't depend on praise. And it is only when there is no longer a need to prove anything that humanity begins to recover. It was during those seemingly uneventful days that Lydia began to realize that she wasn't alone in carrying the wounds, and that Arthur's silence, if listened to long enough, also held unspoken secrets. Winter arrives at Juniper Crossing quietly without warning. There was no major storm, no heavy snowfall, just a gradual chill in the evening, causing people to instinctively pull their chairs closer to the fireplace and speak less, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things should be kept silent. Evelyn Parker realized this one very ordinary evening. A small fire blazed in the hearth. The wood crackled. Orange light fell on the old wooden wall, softening the cracks that had been there for years. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, mending a coat. Her needle moved slowly, steadily, unhurriedly. Her hands had stopped trembling, but she was still careful, as if unwilling to harm anything, not even the fabric. Daniel Mercer sat opposite, adjusting the worn reins. He bowed his head, concentrating, his shoulders slightly slumped. It wasn't the look of someone tired, but of someone accustomed to carrying their own weight, no longer trying to hide it. They didn't say anything. No need. Evenings at Juniper Crossing gradually became like that. No one said it. No one agreed to it. It was simply a rhythm that formed naturally, like water finding its riverbed. Evelyn used to think that silence would make her uneasy. In the past, silence was often a sign of something about to happen, an argument, a reprimand, or worse, an unannounced abandonment. But here, silence takes on a different form. It didn't demand anything. It didn't pry. It didn't pressure her to fill in with explanations. Once, when Evelyn accidentally dropped her scissors, the metallic sound echoed clearly in the room. She jumped, her heart beating a little faster. Daniel looked up at her. "It's all right," he said very softly. Just 2 words. But it was enough for her to understand that he had noticed the reaction and chosen not to make it worse. Daniel rarely talks about himself. It wasn't because he was mysterious, but because he didn't see his story as something that needed to be told to prove anything. Evelyn noticed this from the small details, the way he paused for a second when mentioning an old name, the way he looked at the fire longer than usual on windy nights, the way he never sat with his back to the door. Once, Evelyn asked very gently, "Have you lived here long?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He set the reins aside and added a log to the fireplace. The fire flared up, then died down. "Long enough to know this place doesn't ask about the past," he said. Then he returned to his work. Evelyn didn't ask any further questions. It wasn't out of fear. Rather, she understood that some questions, if treated with respect, would find their answers when the time came. Instead, she began to feel something different. With each passing night at Juniper Crossing, her body felt less exhausted. The dull aches lessened. Sleep came more easily. And most importantly, she no longer felt like she had to struggle to survive. One evening, when the wind outside was blowing stronger than usual, Evelyn put down her needle and thread and looked around the room, not to check, but as if to memorize. Have you ever noticed? She paused, searching for the right words. That this place seems to hold everything together. Daniel looked up. He looked at her for a long time. Not scrutinizing, not surprised. Just an understanding look, as if he had thought it before but had never said it aloud. Yes, he replied. It doesn't fix anything. It just prevents things from breaking further. Evelyn nodded. That statement struck a chord with something she felt but couldn't quite put a name to. Juniper Crossing didn't make her forget her past hurts. It only gave her a stable place where the broken pieces wouldn't continue to fall. Their feelings for each other didn't develop through grand moments. No longer the necessary glances. No touching, no promises. It came about with Daniel always leaving an empty chair by the fireplace even when he thought she would go to bed early. With Evelyn making an extra cup of coffee each morning without asking if he wanted one because she knew he would drink it. One evening Daniel coughed, trying to hide it. Evelyn got up, took the thin blanket hanging on the chair and gently placed it over his shoulders. She didn't look at him while doing so. Daniel didn't say thank you. He just pulled the blanket back into place. And in that small gesture there was a quiet acknowledgement they were caring for each other in a way that didn't demand a name. Evelyn realized she started thinking about Daniel when he wasn't there. Not in a romantic way, but rather a feeling of missing a familiar rhythm. Like when the fireplace hasn't been lit, the room is still the same room but colder. Daniel changed too, though he didn't say it out loud. He began staying in the kitchen longer in the evenings. He put down his work earlier. Sometimes he would tell a very short story without beginning or end about a distant field, a winter long ago, a decision that could not be reversed. Evelyn listened, without asking any questions. She understood that being listened to without pressure was a rare form of healing. One evening, when the wind had died down, Daniel looked at the fire and said, as if talking to himself, "There are some people who don't need anyone to fix them. They just need not to be hurt anymore." Evelyn did not answer. She simply placed her hand on the edge of the table, took a deep breath, and realized she no longer felt as disconnected as before. Not because she had healed, but because there was someone else who also carried those cracks and didn't see them as a reason to distance themselves from her. Two wounded individuals sitting by a fire, not seeking to mend each other's wounds, but through their enduring presence they created a space where hurt was no longer something to be ashamed of. And in that space something very slowly, very real is beginning to take shape. Just as Evelyn began to believe that Juniper Crossing had become a part of her, the past which had never truly disappeared quietly sought to return, bringing with it the gazes and memories she thought she had left behind. The path leading to Maple Crossing remains unchanged. It was still the same brown dirt road, the same wooden milestones leaning in the wind, the same vast open space that made people feel small as they walked through. But for Clara Whitfield everything was different, not because the town had changed, but because she was no longer the woman who had walked through this place with her head bowed. She sat upright in the carriage seat. It wasn't intentional. Not to show off. It's just that for the first time in a long time her body no longer felt the need to withdraw. The person at the helm is Matthew Hale. He didn't ask Clara if she was sure. He didn't advise her to stay. When she said she wanted to go back to Maple Crossing to buy some winter supplies, he just nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world, an adult making a decision, and another respecting that decision. The horse-drawn carriage stopped in front of the general store. The sound of wheels grinding on the gravel echoed clearly enough to make a few people in the town look up. Maple Crossing wasn't large. The memories here weren't lost, they just lay dormant, waiting for the right opportunity to surface. Clara got out first. She didn't search for Matthew with her eyes. There was no need. She knew he was behind her, not too close, not too far. That distance, just enough not to overwhelm, just enough not to leave her behind, made her feel secure. A few people recognized her. There were looks of surprise. There were looks of scrutiny. And there were looks that carried an old, unwashed-away feeling. The man emerged from the side of the pub. Franklin Dobbs. He hadn't changed much, still the same tilted hat, the same half-smile, and the same look that had once made Clara feel like a misplaced object. He looked her up and down slowly, as if searching for a familiar feeling. "Look who's back," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "They didn't go very far, did they?" Clara felt her heart beating faster. "There's no need to be afraid." It's a memory. She remembered very clearly the last time, the day she stood on this very street, bowing her head before the insults. Not because she believed him right, but because she didn't think she had the right to resist. This time she didn't bow her head. Matthew stepped forward and stood beside her. He didn't block her view. He didn't put his hand on her. He just stood there, straight, still, and present enough for everyone to understand that what was happening was no longer Clara's private matter. "Say that again," Matthew said. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but it cut through the noisy air like a straight line. Franklin raised an eyebrow. "What does that have to do with you?" Matthew looked him straight in the eye. "You insulted her. In public. And you will apologize." A few people stopped. The general store became quieter. Conversations faded away. At Maple Crossing, everyone understood when to stop and watch. Franklin sneered. "Sorry." For what? Matthew didn't move. He didn't draw his weapon. He just spoke each word clear. "Because you treated a human being as if she were worthless." Nobody laughed. Franklin glanced around. His eyes met others, not with anger, but with anticipation. Maple Crossing was used to letting things like that slide. But today something else was holding them back. "You have no right," Franklin began. "I don't need power," Matthew interrupted. "I just need you to do the right thing." Clara stood there listening. She realized Matthew wasn't speaking for her. He wasn't expressing her anger on her behalf. He wasn't demanding her honor back. He was simply setting the standard and leaving Franklin to face it herself. A long silence followed. Franklin looked at Clara. For the first time, his eyes lacked confidence. There was no longer mockery, only the embarrassment of someone forced to confront their own shortcomings in front of others. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low, unwilling, but audible. Clara took a deep breath. She didn't say it's okay. She didn't say let's just forget about it. She simply nodded slowly and said, "That's enough." 2 words. But for Clara Whitfield, it was the first time in her life she stood tall before the town that had once made her bow her head. Matthew said nothing more. He turned and walked away as if it were over, because to him it really was over. No need to win or lose. No need for confrontation. They went into the general store and bought what they needed. No one made a fuss. No one said anything more. Maple Crossing returned to its normal rhythm, but a small crack had appeared in the old routine. On her way to the carriage, Clara paused for a moment. "You don't need to do that," she said. Matthew shook his head. "I didn't do it because she couldn't do it herself. I did it because he needed to be reminded." Clara looked at him. In that moment she understood that this was not a man who would win by force, but a man who would restore order with honor. The horse-drawn carriage rolled away from Maple Crossing. Clara sat still, her hands on her lap, feeling the familiar rhythm of movement. But inside her something had risen and no longer intended to sit down. Just when Clara thought the past had been put back in its place, she discovered that Matthew Hale also carried an unspoken past, a past that the law had called out but whose conscience had never forgotten. The afternoon in Cottonwood Bend dragged on slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated before setting behind the hills. Hannah Brooks stood in the general store, her hands turning over old newspapers bound together with jute string. The smell of damp paper and faded ink evoked a distant feeling of days when it was believed that everything once printed would last forever. She wasn't looking for anything specific. It was just an old habit: look, read, then put it back. But when she turned to the last page, her eyes stopped. An old wanted poster, its edges frayed, the print faded with age. The sketch was indistinct, just a few stiff pencil lines, a face in profile, deep-set eyes. The man's name printed below made Hannah's hand freeze. Samuel Reed. Her heart skipped a beat, as if her body were double-checking the information before allowing fear to take hold. She read more carefully. Wanted for murder. The incident occurred in Millstone 14 years ago. There aren't many details. Just a short, dry sentence, the kind of language the law uses to condense an entire life into a few words. Hannah folded the paper and placed it on the counter as if afraid it would stain her hands. She didn't tremble. She wasn't panicking, Just an empty space opened up in her chest, a place where she had previously placed her trust so carefully. That evening the wind blew stronger than usual. The fire in the fireplace burned high, then died down. Samuel sat in his usual chair adjusting an iron hook. Hannah set dinner on the table as she did every day. Nobody said anything, but Hannah knew this silence was different. When they finished eating, she got up, cleared the dishes, and returned to sit opposite him. She hadn't taken the poster with her. No need. Things that had been read couldn't be put back in their place. "Samuel," she said, her voice even not accusatory. "Were you ever at Millstone?" Samuel looked up. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask where she knew. His gaze, for the first time since Hannah had known him, didn't waver, but it didn't seek to protect either. "Yes," he replied. A long silence followed. The fire crackled. "And he killed someone?" Hannah asked further. Samuel set the hook down. He opened his hands and placed them on the table, a gesture of someone who neither hides nor begs. "I killed him," he said. "And I know that can't be called by any other name." Hannah took a deep breath. "Why?" she asked. Samuel gazed at the fire for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and slow, as if each word had been carefully considered for years. "He ruined my wife," he said. While the law looked away, he told very little. He didn't describe. He didn't paint a picture of the pain. He only said what needed to be said, and stopped when he had said enough. She reported it. No one came. No one asked. He's still walking around town like a decent man. Samuel's hand tightened slightly, then released. I waited. I hoped someone would do the right thing, but no one did. Hannah listened, a heavy feeling growing in her chest. She saw no images of violence, only a series of doors closing one by one. "I'm not proud," Samuel continued. "Neither am I asking for forgiveness. I just can't let him live as if he never did anything." Hannah bowed her head. She thought of Maple Crossing, of Franklin Dobbs, of the times women were forced into silence because of insufficient evidence, because it shouldn't be made a big deal out of it. She thought of herself, and the moments when she had chosen silence, for fear of the consequences. "Do you regret it?" she asked very softly. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He got up, added more wood to the fire, and then spoke. "I regret that the law forced me to choose between two things that were both wrong. That statement doesn't justify anything. It raises a question." Hannah sat there, understanding that the twist of life wasn't that Samuel had once killed someone, but the fact that there are situations where right and wrong no longer stand on clearly defined sides. "And what about me?" she asked. "Do you think I should have known sooner?" Samuel turned and looked directly at her. "I'm ready to speak when you're ready to listen," he replied. "If you wish to leave, I understand. No clinging, no excuses. It's simply a man putting the power of choice back in the hands of the person opposite him." Hannah felt tears welling up, but she didn't let them fall. Not because she was strong, but because she needed to think. She stood up and walked out onto the porch. It was getting dark. The wind was cold. Hannah crossed her arms and looked out at the prairie. She wondered what this twist forced her to confront. If it were me, what would I do when the law turned its back on me? There are no easy answers. She turned back inside the house and looked at Samuel, the man who had lived a decent life, who had respected her every day, who had set clear boundaries and never crossed them. His past cannot be erased, but his present situation is also undeniable. Hannah sat down, not closer, not further away. She simply said, "I need time." Samuel nodded. "I understand." That night they slept in separate rooms as usual. There was no conflict, no hasty decisions. Only honesty had just been laid on the table, heavy, but necessary. And somewhere within Hannah something began to take shape, not forgiveness but the maturation of choice. After that night, Hannah understood that what mattered wasn't whether Samuel's past was terrifying or not, but where she would choose to stand when the truth had been told and fear could no longer conceal it. Mornings in Elmwood Prairie arrived very slowly. It wasn't because the sun was lazy, but because dew still clung to the grass and the wind wasn't yet strong enough to dispel the lingering chill from the night before. Margaret Sloane stood on the steps of her house, draped in a thin woolen sweater, gazing out at the vast field stretching before her. Everything looked strangely familiar, as if this place had been here for a long time, just waiting for her to be calm enough to see it. She barely slept last night. Not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, She had a real choice, and that choice weighed more heavily than fear. Behind her, the wooden door creaked open. Thomas Caldwell stepped out, stopping a few steps away from her. He didn't ask if she had made up her mind. He didn't urge her. He simply stood there, his hand on the railing, looking in the same direction as her. A long time passed. "I'll take you to town if you wish," Thomas said, his voice low and even. "Or to the train station. I'll have the car ready." No but, no if. It was just a door opening without any pressure. Margaret nodded slightly but didn't turn to look at him. "I know." She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp grass and fresh earth. The smells were so real, unlike the vague memories she had clung to in order to survive. "You don't have to do that," she said. "You don't owe me anything." Thomas's lips curved slightly, not in a smile. "You don't owe me anything either." That statement made Margaret close her eyes for a moment. Throughout her life, she had become accustomed to every relationship carrying an invisible thread, obligation, fear, or gratitude being exploited. At Elmwood Prairie, that thread didn't exist. She turned around and looked at Thomas. In the dim morning light, he didn't look like the man in the wanted poster she'd read the night before, nor did he resemble the murderer the law had named. He was the one who had repaired the fence before the strong wind came. The one who had added more firewood to the fireplace without saying a word. The one who had kept his word by living each day as he pleased without needing anyone to witness it. "Do you know what I fear most?" Margaret asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "But I'm willing to listen." Margaret looked down at her hands, old calluses, veins bulging from years of labor. "I'm afraid I'll make the wrong choice again," she said. "Afraid that today's kindness will become the price to pay tomorrow." Thomas remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't try to reassure. He understood that the fear didn't need to be dispelled, it needed to be acknowledged. "You have every right to be afraid," he said finally. "But you don't need to stay because you're afraid to leave." Margaret lifted her head. That statement touched the deepest part of her. Not because it was beautiful, but because it put responsibility back in its place where the decision rested with her, not circumstances. She thought back to her early days at Elmwood Prairie. Quiet mornings, meals that needed no explanation, nights spent sleeping without fear of footsteps. All of this wasn't magic, but a man who chose to live a disciplined life, and a woman who was gradually rediscovering the importance of a regular rhythm of life. "I watched him for a long time," Margaret said. "Not to find fault, but to see how he lived when no one was watching." Thomas said nothing, and I realized, she continued, her voice firmer, that he wasn't the man defined by the worst moment of his life. A gentle breeze blew across the field. The grass swayed, and then stood still. Margaret stepped down the steps. No rush, no hesitation. She stood before Thomas, the distance between them just enough to avoid intruding, yet enough for a decision to be made without defensiveness. "I didn't stay because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I stayed because I chose him and chose myself in this life." Thomas looked at her for a long time. No joy, no outward emotion, just a deep gaze as if he were receiving it with all the seriousness it deserved. "Are you sure?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes, I'll stay." Not a big statement, just a truth spoken at the right time. Thomas turned ahead and opened the door. "Then let's begin the day," he said. "No ceremony, no promises of the future." Margaret followed him inside, clearly sensing that this decision wouldn't resolve all her fears, but it placed her in a position where fear was no longer her guide. And that, for her, was freedom. When Margaret chose to stay at Elmwood Prairie, it wasn't because all her fears had disappeared, but because she understood that there are promises that don't need to be spoken, that only need to be made true by living together long enough. Spring arrives at High Meadow Ranch, not with a riot of blossoms, but with slightly longer mornings. The sun rose earlier and lingered longer on the wooden porch. The wind was no longer sharp. The earth softened enough to begin thinking about planting. Agnes Whitaker realized this as she hung her winter coat back in the corner of the closet, not because the weather had warmed up, but because she knew she wouldn't need it as often anymore. Life in High Meadow goes on as it always has. No day was marked as special. No one mentioned a new milestone. George Miller got up early and went to the stables. Agnes prepared breakfast. They ate together, cleaned up, and then each went about their own business. Everything went on so regularly that if someone were looking from the outside, it would be difficult to notice that something very important was taking shape. There was no marriage proposal. No one knelt. No flowers. No witnesses. No memorable words. It was only one afternoon when Agnes was mending George's old shirt. Her stitches were slow, steady, not necessarily beautiful. George stood leaning against the doorframe, watching her work, not with a possessive gaze but with the familiarity of someone who had been there long enough to no longer need to ask. "This shirt is still wearable," Agnes said, as if talking to herself. George nodded. Yes. He stood there for a moment longer, then went into the bedroom. When he came out, he was carrying a small, unpolished, unadorned wooden box. He placed it on the table, gently pushing it towards Agnes. "This one," he said, "if you think it's suitable." Agnes opened the box. Inside was a simple ring. No gemstones, no carvings, just a smooth metal band polished so finely that it reflected light very softly. She didn't ask him where he bought it. She didn't ask when. She didn't ask why. She understood perfectly well this ring didn't represent a new promise, but rather an acknowledgement of something that already existed. Agnes held the ring in her hand, feeling its weight. Not heavy, but it was substantial enough. "We're not young anymore," she said, her voice calm. George nodded. "No, and I don't need anyone to promise that everything will be easy." "Me too." Agnes looked at him. "I just need to know that every morning when I wake up I'm still respected." George looked directly at her. "You already have that." Agnes placed the ring down on the table. She didn't rush to wear it. She didn't express any emotion. It was simply a carefully considered decision, like so many others in her life, thorough, not based on a sudden impulse. "Well then," she said, "we can say we understand each other." George smiled faintly. Not a smile of overflowing happiness, but the smile of someone relieved that they no longer had to prove anything. They didn't have a wedding. No town invitations. No ceremony. No white dress. No toasts. In High Meadow, marriage is not an event but a continuation. Agnes started wearing the ring on the days she went out. George did too. No one explained. No one asked. Those around them saw it, nodded, and went back to their work. It was understood. Their marriage wasn't built on romance. It is built on discipline, time, work, boundaries, on respect, non-intrusion, non-control, not demanding the impossible, and on gratitude, a gratitude that doesn't need to be spoken every day but is shown through not taking each other's presence for granted. There were evenings when they sat together for long periods in silence. There were days when they argued about trivial things, how to fix the fence, how to plant potatoes, how to manage finances. But none of the arguments were meant to hurt because they both understood that the goal wasn't to win but to continue living together tomorrow. Agnes realized she had stopped waiting for big moments. No more waiting for the perfect words. No more waiting for emotions to surge. She found contentment in George setting out a warm cup of tea on a cold morning, in him adjusting the steps so she wouldn't trip, in him leaving the light on if she came home late. George felt the same way. He wasn't seeking admiration. He didn't need to be thanked for what he did. He just needed to know that this house wasn't a place where he had to play a role. One evening while Agnes was doing her accounting, George said very softly, "I never thought I'd live like this again." Agnes didn't look up. "Me neither. But I don't want to live differently." Agnes stopped writing and looked at him. "Because we've lived long enough to know what's necessary." George nodded. Their love wasn't a raging fire. It's a smoldering charcoal stove, warm enough to get through the winter, durable enough not to be extinguished by strong winds. And for those who have experienced so much heartbreak, that is more precious than any vow. High Meadow Ranch hasn't changed because they got married. But Agnes and George do. It's not because they've become different people. It's because they no longer need to be on guard in their own homes. And just as High Meadow Ranch settled into a seemingly stable rhythm of life, a small but significant event quietly emerged, reminding them that life always finds a way to continue along the simplest paths. That summer we arrived at Silver Willows Ranch cautiously. There were no scorching early summer suns, no strong winds, just mornings that were a little warmer and evenings with a few extra minutes of light. Clara Holden noticed this as she stood on the porch, her hand resting gently on her belly, listening to the changing rhythm of life both outside and inside. She is more than 3 months pregnant. No one in the ranch made a big fuss. No loud congratulations. No one spoke of the future as if it were a certainty. Just a new truth accepted with the composure of those who had lived long enough to understand that hope doesn't always come with assurance. Nathan Cole learned the news on an ordinary afternoon. Clara spoke very softly as they repaired the south-facing fence where the winter winds usually blew strongest. She didn't look at him as she spoke, not out of fear, but because that was how she always dealt with important matters, without dramatizing, without demanding an immediate reaction. Nathan said nothing for a few seconds. He put down the hammer, took off his gloves, and then asked just one question. "Are you all right?" Clara nodded. Nathan nodded in response. No tears, no big smiles. But from that day on, he quietly changed a few habits, paying more attention when Clara carried heavy water, adjusting the steps so she wouldn't slip, and every morning always leaving a chair ready in a shady spot. That's how he welcomed new life, through actions, not promises. That same summer, Clara suggested building a small room next to the old barn. "Not for you," she said. "For the kids around here." Nathan didn't ask any further questions. He understood. Silver Willows is more than an hour's ride from the nearest town. Children in the area typically grow up among pastures and barns, learning to work at a young age but rarely receiving a proper education. Clara had been a teacher long before life took a different turn for the better. The room was built slowly. No signboard, no budget, just leftover wood, a long table, a few chairs put together, and a window facing east to let in the early morning light. Nathan built the walls. Clara cleaned. They worked in silence, as if this wasn't a new project but a continuation of the lives they were living. There were 4 children in the first lesson. No uniforms, no new books, just a few notebooks, short pencils, and a woman who spoke to them in a slow, clear, unhurried voice. Clara didn't teach them to dream of becoming something great. She taught them to read, to write, and to know that they had value even in becoming someone other than themselves. Nathan stood outside the window looking in. He didn't step in. He didn't interfere. But he was always there, like a solid boundary, ensuring that everything inside could safely exist. The 2 rings were still on their fingers. Not new, not shiny. Each one carries a different past, losses, choices, things that can't be undone. But they don't erase each other. They exist side by side, like 2 people who chose to stay together without demanding to forget what they once were. Clara understood this more clearly than ever as she sat alone in the empty classroom late one afternoon. Sunlight streamed in through the window. The tables and chairs were neatly arranged. Chalk dust floated in the air. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling a very slight movement, uncertain but enough to make her stop and take a deep breath. She didn't think about a bright future. She thought about tomorrow, breakfast, the next lesson, the fence that needed fixing, the firewood that needed chopping. Small, specific tasks, real enough to focus on. Nathan stood at the door. "Are you tired?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "No. I'm just thinking." About what? Clara looked around the room. I never dreamed of this life." Nathan nodded. "Me too. But I don't want to live differently." Nathan looked at her, his eyes calm. "Because we built it with our own hands." Clara smiled very slightly. She understood that hope doesn't come like a beautiful dream. It comes like a daily routine, sometimes tiring, sometimes boring, but kind enough not to betray people. Summer has passed. A few more children joined the class. Nathan fixed the roof. Clara wrote more lessons. The baby in her womb grew. There was no final climax, no closing music. Only life goes on. And if someone were to ask Clara Holden what saved her, love, marriage, or the unborn child, she would probably answer very slowly. It's not a dream. Rather, it is kindness practiced every day, even if no one witnesses it. Years later, when people mention Warren Ranch, they no longer remember exactly why it was once considered an isolated place. All that is remembered is that on the western edge of the Red Hollow Prairie, there was a farm that was not large, not wealthy, but never closed to anyone who truly needed a place to stop. Autumn arrived early that year. The birch trees surrounding the ranch were beginning to shed their leaves as Eleanor Hayes stepped slowly onto the porch, her hand resting on the wooden railing worn smooth by time. She was no longer young. Her hair was streaked with gray. The old scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. In the yard, Caleb Warren was repairing a section of the fence. His movements were slower than before, but still steady, unpretentious, unhurried. He worked as he had lived his whole life, with moderation and thoroughness. They don't need to look at each other to know the other person is there. Their presence had become a part of the landscape, like the wind, the earth, the twilight. Their child, now grown, was helping a neighbor's boy practice reading in the small study behind the shed. The spelling sounds echoed out slow and repetitive. Eleanor heard them and smiled very softly. She recalled the day that room was first built. No signboards. No declarations. Just a very simple decision: if you can give someone more than you've ever received, then do it. Caleb never called it help. He simply said, "There's still room here." Red Hollow doesn't become a better town overnight. It still has its rough people. There are still prejudices. There are still those who choose to turn away. But the difference is people no longer easily ignore it as before. Women traveling alone are no longer seen as a burden. Poor children are no longer considered invisible. Not because of new laws, not because of speeches, because people have seen a living example. They had seen Eleanor Hayes, who had once stepped off a mail-order van, bruised and battered, stand tall in town. They had seen Caleb Warren, the man of few words, force an offend to apologize without bloodshed. Those things remain in the community's memory for a long time, even though no one names them. Eleanor and Caleb did not become new people. They are not completely healed. There is no day when the past disappears. But the important thing is the past no longer controls the present. Eleanor still had nights when she woke up from old dreams. Caleb still had afternoons that were quieter than usual. But now they didn't have to face it alone. No one forced the other person to speak. No one asked the other person to forget. Their love wasn't about soothing every pain, but about saying, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." People often think of heritage as money, land, or fame. But the legacy that Eleanor and Caleb left behind cannot be recorded in writing. That is, times a child learns that they deserve to be listened to. Asterisk. A woman who knows she has the right to say no. Asterisk. A man who understands that strength lies not in brute force, but in setting standards. Those things spread very slowly. But they didn't disappear. If someone were to ask Eleanor what her story was about, she probably wouldn't tell it from the beginning. She would simply say, "There are people who don't need to be rescued. They just need a safe place where they won't be harmed further." If you were to ask Caleb, he would probably nod and say, "Life doesn't give anyone the right to do what's right. It only gives us the opportunity to choose." Evening falls at Warren Ranch. Caleb put away his tools. Eleanor prepared dinner. The children's reading had stopped. A gentle breeze blew across the meadow. There's no grand finale. No climactic music. There is only one way of life, one built on discipline, respect, and kindness, repeated every day. And if there's one thing this story leaves for the listener, it's probably this: some lives cannot be rebuilt by dreams, but by people choosing to live decent lives even when no one forces them to. I don't know exactly when I first heard the story of Eleanor Hayes and Caleb Warren. It could have been late one evening in a small kitchen in Red Hollow when the oil lamp was burning dimly and someone mentioned Warren Ranch, as if by old habit. Or it could have been on a windy morning when I was young, standing by the wooden fence and hearing the adults say, "If you don't know where to go, just try that." Stories like these often lack a clear beginning date. They creep into life like wind through a slightly ajar door, not noisy but enough to leave a lasting impression. This story isn't told as a hero's tale. There are no embellished details for dramatic effect. No one is saying that Caleb Warren is the perfect man, or that Eleanor Hayes is a woman who never gives up. Opposite. They are told about them very simply, as if they were two people who chose to live decent lives in an era where kindness wasn't always rewarded. They say Eleanor once stepped down from the mail-order carriage in a state no one wants to remember. They say Caleb used to be such a taciturn man that many thought he was cold. But then the story always ends at the same point: he didn't leave. She didn't bow her head again. There are no streets in Red Hollow named after Eleanor Hayes. There are no headstones inscribed with Caleb Warren's name. And perhaps they wouldn't want that either, because what they leave behind is not measured by how many times people remember their names, but by how people have changed the way they treat each other after hearing their stories. People started paying more attention to those who came to town alone. They stopped laughing when they saw a woman without a man. They learned to be silent when necessary and to speak up when needed. No one came forward to claim that it was thanks to Eleanor or Caleb, but everyone knows where things started to go wrong. When the children growing up in Red Hollow asked the adults why the small classroom at Warren Ranch was always open, they weren't being taught a moral lesson. They only heard that because there was a time when children were never taught to read or write. And someone decided that shouldn't happen again. When someone asks why a public apology carries so much weight in Red Hollow, the answer is, because there was a time when an apology helped a woman stand tall for the first time in her life. The story changes form over time, but it never loses its core. I used to think that stories like these would fade away once the storyteller passed away. But I was wrong. The story of Eleanor and Caleb doesn't exist because someone is trying to keep it. It exists because it touches something very real within every human being. Fear of abandonment, desire to be treated as a human being with dignity, and a yearning to live a decent life, even when life isn't kind to you. Those things don't belong to one era. I'll put it this way. It wasn't because Eleanor Hayes suffered so much. It wasn't because Caleb Warren did something brave, but because they didn't become spiteful even though they had every reason to be. Because they didn't use their own pain to justify hurting others. And because in a harsh world, it's not an easy choice. What I appreciate most about this story is, it doesn't tell you to become a hero. It doesn't tell you to sacrifice your whole life. It doesn't tell you to save someone. It simply posed a very quiet question. If one day you had the power to turn away, would you have the courage to stay? Eleanor Hayes and Caleb Warren eventually grew old. The ranch is still there. Red Hollow continues to change in its own way. New people arrive, old people leave. But one thing remains. Not images, not dialogue. It's a silent standard. Don't turn away when you can choose to be kind. Don't judge when you haven't lived someone else's life. And don't underestimate the power of small, repeated actions every day. If you ask me what makes a life valuable after having heard and retold this story many times, I won't talk about success. I won't talk about fame. I won't talk about being remembered. I would say that a life worth living is one in which kindness continues to live on even after the person has passed away. And perhaps that's why years later when people mention Warren Ranch they still speak in a slightly slower tone. The story of Eleanor Hayes and Caleb Warren doesn't tell us that life will always be fair. On the contrary, it reminds us that the world very often abandons the most vulnerable, and that's why kindness is so precious. Eleanor was not saved by a miracle. She was saved by ordinary days, a clean bed, a hot meal, clear rules that demanded no price. The story reminds us that healing doesn't come from grand promises, but from the security of everyday repetition. Caleb wasn't a perfect hero. He was simply a man who chose to live right, even when no one forced him to. And that's a profound lesson for all of us. A person's worth doesn't lie in their darkest past, but in how they treat others when they have the right to do the opposite. In today's world, we may not live in Red Hollow, but every day we face the same choices as Caleb and Eleanor times. Should I turn away or stay put? Asterisk. To judge or to listen? Asterisk. Should you live a good life, even if no one acknowledges it? This story reminds us that life is not rebuilt by dreams, but by kindness one day at a time. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story resonated with you, please like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread stories of kindness, honor, and quiet hope amidst this life full of hurt.